In 2014, I quit my full-time editing job to start freelancing. Leah had been laid off the previous year after a successful career in public health. That was the December of the polar vortex. So at the last minute, we decided to spend a week in Tulum, Mexico. I found us a cheap room on the beach at what I read online was an eco-friendly hotel, which in this case was Spanish for pretty crummy. There was no hot water and the electricity was turned off at 5 p.m. But it was romantic, and Leah and I had had a million travel adventures, places like Italy and Spain and Turkey and Costa Rica. This would be another adventure. Somehow we found out the hotel manager was a Venezuelan Jew. One day she described just how bad things were in her country, that she was supporting her whole family back home. It was Hanukkah, and Leah and I mentioned we'd brought along a menorah. So that evening, at twilight, the three of us lit candles in the fading light inside the hotel office. Hearing the brachas, our host quietly began weeping because life was so hard back home and her family was so far away and she hadn't heard those blessings since she was a little girl. And that was one Hanukkah Leah and I will never forget. Later that evening, walking along the beach, holding hands with my wife of 3 decades, I remember thinking, boy, I am the luckiest man on the face of the earth. The following spring, in 2015, Leah traveled to Tunisia to do volunteer work with a stopover in Israel. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into too many details. She had had seasonal affective disorder in the past, and she'd managed it well by taking Prozac for many years. But seemingly overnight, it was like Leah's mind was taken over by an alien force. There were time zone changes and missed medication doses, and for a few days, no sleep. She called me crying from Tunisia, frantically emailed me dozens of messages laced with venom, screamed at me on the phone and emails about what a horrible husband I was. She said she had saved a poet's life, a firestorm of grandiosity and rage. And I had no idea what was real. Well, when Leah returned to the States, I bore the brunt of her anger that whole summer, her rants until 2 in the morning, her manipulation and gaslighting, her endless distractions, her relentless swearing, emails and text messages to our adult kids and me, and I wondered if I was losing my mind. I can kind of laugh now, but there was weird stuff. At our daughter's wedding that summer, which could have been a book in itself, there was a TSA incident, and a flight attendant incident, and a stapler incident. Now, the word incident is sort of a code that people like me use to talk about our lives. Some guy in New Hampshire who read my book emailed me about a smoothie incident involving his sick wife. I didn't have to ask. There was an incident involving a smoothie, and my family had an incident involving a stapler. Enough said. Well, not so funny was the shower stall incident, and before that, the Jeff got locked out of the house incident. That night, I became unglued, curled up literally in the fetal position on the floor at my friend's house where I was hiding, consumed with fear, confusion, and above all, guilt. Leah had no idea where I was, and she was probably worried sick. In response to the stress, my digestive system turned into Mount St. Helens. I lost 10 pounds. I oozed anxiety so badly that I ended up going to our general practitioner, Dr. Woody, for help. After hearing what was going on, Dr. Woody was the first to recognize Leah was having a manic episode. Now, unfortunately, the worst part of all this was Leah's anosognosia, a word I didn't know at the time. It's not denial, it's a person's lack of insight, a symptom of a severe mental illness that impairs someone's ability to understand and perceive their own condition. So, although all of us who knew Leah, including our kids, were shocked by the upheaval in her behavior, there was no way for anyone to convince Leah she was manic. Finally, on September 1st, 2015, I got a call from the psych ER at Hennepin County Medical Center. Leah was admitted with a diagnosis of late-onset bipolar disorder. Now, after she spent weeks on the psychiatric ward, she came home and she and our whole family had to somehow pick up the pieces. Well, with her prescribed mood stabilizers, almost inevitably, within a month, Leah's brain slammed on the brakes. She fell into a half year's hellish depression. She barely got out of bed, barely ate, barely did personal hygiene. Instead, she spent that winter and spring hidden under the blankets in our darkened bedroom. She couldn't make a decision or interact with the world. She said she wasn't sad. She said she was empty, that she felt nothing. All Leah could do was survive another day. And seemingly overnight, I went from a walk on the beach with my loving wife of 30 years to a guy married to a person twirling around like a whirling dervish to a man who had to learn to care for a woman mired in a major depressive episode. Let's just say I no longer felt like the luckiest man on the face of the earth. According to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, or NAMI, 3/4 of mental illnesses begin by age 24. The National Institute of Mental Health reported in 2019 that bipolar disorder affects about 2.6% of Americans age 18 and older. The average age at onset for a first manic episode is during the early 20s. Only about 10% of cases of bipolar disorder have onset after the age of 50. No matter what the age of onset of a personality or mood disorder, 100% of family members of those struggling with their mental health are affected by it. I was, as was our whole family. Leah's cycle repeated in 2016, another manic episode and hospitalization, followed by an even worse major depression and eventual fourth hospital stay. The med changes in therapy, including electroconvulsive therapy, 2 rounds of dialectical behavioral therapy, partial day treatment, even a day at the Mayo Clinic, seemed like expensive, exasperating exercises in futility. Well, let me assure you at this point, I don't like to speak for Leah. So I asked her this morning how she's doing, and she said, good. And more to the point of this conference, I'm doing pretty doggone well myself. So well, in fact, that I'm gratified to spend the rest of our time together focusing on how I learned so much about living with and loving so deeply a woman who never asked for a severe mental illness, and how I learned so much about my own well-being.